Hello there, and welcome to the second week of Atheism for Lent. I've got to say that I am very excited and passionate about this journey, especially this year. I don't know why it is. I think maybe it's every year I get excited about it. But I noticed in the last couple of days as it kicked off, my mind has been firing off. In fact, I'm changing things as I go. So if you're sneakily looking forward into what's ahead, you'll miss the fact that I'm changing things. Like I've already changed something about tomorrow. So if you've already looked at tomorrow, look at it again, because I've added somebody. And I guess, I don't know why, I'm just excited about introducing some of you to some of the thinkers, some of the people that we'll be looking at over the next 40 days, and also reintroducing some of you. Many of you have done this before. But I also really believe in the value of this practice. I believe in its importance. In fact, just before we officially kicked off, I was talking about the desire to actually grow atheism for Lent, that organically it's actually become one of the biggest things that I do. And that's with me being absolutely terrible at organizational stuff, absolutely awful at advertising and all of that kind of thing. So if with my incompetence, and by the way, you saw my incompetence a number of times if you were on my Patreon, like putting wrong links in or you giving wrong information. But if I can get this far on my abilities, then potentially this can grow to become something very substantial. And then you guys who are doing this are all basically on the ground floor. I mean, I've been running this, and I've said this a few times, but I've been running this for a long time. It's been over 20 years. But that's on and off. And the first groups were literally 5 or 6 of us sitting in my bedroom, just reading a book together. Then it kind of developed, but it's only been a few years where I've done it in this way. I wish, by the way, I could have you all in my room at the moment and we could be doing this in person. But of course, that would be impossible because you are dispersed throughout the world. But yeah, this format is relatively new, and if we can grow this, then you who are doing this today are definitely at the beginning of that. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I wanted to let you know that there is an excitement in me about trying to do justice to the people that we're going to be looking at. And I can say I'm excited about it because it's not me being excited about my own work. I'm just the curator in many ways. I've gone out there and I've picked people who I think have got something really interesting to say. And so my desire is really to be kind of a John the Baptist, preparing the way for the incoming of some incredible truths and ideas and people. And I guess as I get older, that's a passion that is increasingly the most important one to me, that I can be a gateway drug to incredible people, incredible ideas. So that's what I want to be. I want to be in the Atheism for Lent, a gateway drug for you, exploring and finding new people and new ideas. And as somebody said on the Facebook group, they're probably going to be broke at the end of this because there's all these book recommendations of, oh, this person's written this and that. So the truth is, of course, you can always find pirated versions of everything out there, but it's always nice to have the hard copy in your hand. So what I want to do today, and this is what I'll be doing every week, is introducing the week ahead. And this is the first kind of proper week. So last week was really getting ready for delving into the material. It was about kind of helping you experience the kind of vibe of Atheism for Lent, the history of it, where it came from, what we're trying to do. And this week is where we actually get into the journey proper. And so we're going to be starting kind of in the easiest place. And every week this is going to get harder. This is a climb of Everest. And say there are thousands of us at the bottom here, and I just encourage you to try to be one of the ones that gets to the very top. Because every week does get a little bit more difficult. And the format of the seminars that I give will be partly dictated by the material. So for example, this week, I'm going to actually look at every single thinker we're going to be doing, just say a little bit about them, why I picked them, why I think they're important. I've also got some nice stories about a couple of people. I've got a good story about Jean Meslier, and I think a really good story about Anthony Flew. So we can go through basically all of them. Then I'll Then I'll talk a little bit about why I picked them together, what I think you can get out of this week. And finally, I'm going to leave the last word to Anthony Flew, who's the last reflection of this week. So that's what I'll be doing this week. But next week, I'll probably spend most of the seminar looking at just one of the figures, probably Anselm, because Anselm is a very difficult thinker, and if you understand what he's doing, he opens up all of the other thinkers. So one week I'll look at everyone, which is probably just this week, to be honest, and then some weeks we'll just look at one, and maybe other weeks we'll look at 2 or 3. So it all depends on the difficulty of the material. But this week is pretty easy because it's the stuff that most of us are aware of. We're going to be looking at, we don't look at any of the new atheists, but this material that we're looking at is closest to new atheism, which is a form of atheism that most of us have probably had some sort of encounter with. And it's the most kind of straightforward form of kind of analytic, you might want to call it, philosophical critique of religion. And we'll start with tomorrow's reflection. So the first reflection you're going to get is actually from 3 ancient philosophers. They are Protagoras, Epicurus, and Seneca. So Protagoras and Epicurus are ancient Greek philosophers. They're writing before Christ, BC, right? And then there is Seneca, who's born BC and then is writing into the 1st century. So these are very, very kind of like, this is the beginning of philosophy. And what I wanted to do is try to introduce the beginning of religious critique. And I wanted to pick 3 very early representatives of that critique for you. And in a nutshell, you could define these 3 critiques as, let's call them, let's say, an argument of, what was the first one? Argument of, what did I call it? I'm going to have to look it up. My goodness, I just wrote this down. What did I call them? Okay, the argument of improbability. Don't know why I forgot that, right? So the first is the argument of improbability. The second I want to call the argument of incoherence. And the third, the argument of irrelevancy. So the argument of improbability, the argument of incoherence, and the argument of irrelevance. And I was very happy with that because they all begin with I, like any good preacher, 3 points beginning with the same letter, and you're flying, right? So the first one, incoherence, and this is Protagoras. Protagoras is really the first critic of religion, and he takes a position that's often called perspectivalism. And perspectivalism is, apart from a tongue twister, it is the notion that we are the measure of all things. That when we experience the world, we think we're experiencing it as it is, but in the words of Anais Nin, we are experiencing it as we are. So Anais Nin has this beautiful line where she says, "We do not experience the world as it is, but as we are." And that simply means that we experience the world through mediation. We experience it through language, through our senses. We experience it through the way we've been brought up, through our fears and our dreams and our hopes. And all of those are used to measure what we experience in the world. And so Protagoras is the first to kind of say, listen, when it comes to these metaphysical questions, and by metaphysical questions, that's questions that are beyond physicality. Aristotle uses this language, and it's basically the questions of God, the question of freedom, the question of the origin of the universe. Those are these metaphysical questions. When it comes to those, Protagoras is saying that what we think will be a reflection to some extent of who we are and how we see the world and how we've been brought up. And so we should have a certain skepticism about what conclusions we come to. And I call this the argument of improbability because there's still the possibility that you're right about what you think about the world, but it's highly improbable. Actually, Freud used an example of this. I think we may be including it later on in this course, where he talks about the difference between an illusion and a delusion. And he says an illusion is, for example, if a little girl imagines that she's a princess, right? It's an illusion. Right? And it's part of her desire, it's part of a fantasy that maybe she's thinking about in relation to what she's watching and her parents. But it could turn out that actually she is a princess. And maybe they don't know it. They find out that she was adopted and actually she has this royal lineage. So it's an illusion, but it happens to be correct. And so with Protagoras, you could say, well, your belief in whether there's a God or not will be connected to your hopes and your fears, your dreams, your education, all of that stuff. You could be right, but it's improbable. And then he also includes this idea that the difficulty of the question, the obscurity of the question, and the shortness of life combine to also make it improbable that we make any kind of big discovery. Okay, so that's the argument of improbability. Then we have Epicurus, and Epicurus is like, he offers really the first argument against the existence of God. So as some of you will know, there are some very famous arguments for the existence of God. There's the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas. There's the so-called ontological argument by Anselm, and then there's various deviations of those and some different ones. But this is one of the first arguments against the existence of God. And I'm not going to kind of go into it because you're going to see it. But what Epicurus is attempting to do is he's attempting to say that the classical metaphysical notion of God, the classical notion of God as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, unmoving, the uncaused cause, right? What's called the first cause in philosophy. This classical notion of God is actually incoherent. It doesn't work. It's like saying there's a square triangle, right? Now, if I tell you there's a square triangle, or if I say to you there's no such thing as a square triangle, and you start with this. If I say to you there's no such thing as a black swan, right? You can turn around to me and say, well, have you seen every swan, right? And you can say, let's hold back and find out, like, let's go into the world, what's called a posteriori, in other words, after into experience. You go in, you experience the world, and we see if that's true or not. But if I say to you, there are no square triangles, and then you say to me, oh, well, it's like black swans, you haven't seen every triangle. Like, have you seen every triangle in the world? And I go, no. And you go, well, you can't be sure. You're like, no, that's wrong, because a square triangle, you know a priori that's incorrect. So a posteriori is anything that you need to go into the world to discover, right? You need to experiment to discover. And a priori means prior to experience. It's something that you don't need to go into the world to discover. You know whether it's right or wrong. So a square triangle is a priori wrong because a triangle has 3 sides and a square has 4 equal sides. So therefore it's impossible. In the same way, I could say that all bachelors are unmarried. And you can say, well, have you met every bachelor? And I go, well, no, I haven't met every bachelor, but the very definition of bachelor is unmarried man. So I know without going into the world that you will never find a bachelor that is married. And actually, if you go into the world and you test that, so, you're a sociologist and you go in and you ask 10,000 bachelors or 10,000 people whether they know a bachelor who's married, you'll actually get a fraction of a % who say yes, because maybe they misunderstand what the word bachelor means, right? But actually, it's impossible no matter what the empirical evidence is. So in the same way, Epicurus basically offers an argument where he says the classical notion of God just can't be right, in its existing form. So it's impossible. And then finally, I mentioned Seneca. Seneca's argument is perhaps the most interesting. It's the argument of the irrelevance of God. And he makes 3 statements. He basically says, one is, you don't need to fear God. Secondly, you don't need to seek God. And thirdly, you don't need to envy God. You don't need to look up to God. And he says, basically, right, you don't need to fear God. once you've had Stoic enlightenment, so he's a Stoic, and there's a type of Stoic enlightenment, and once you've achieved this enlightenment, the Stoic has no need to fear kings, no need to fear tyrants, and no need to fear God. The Stoic is someone who's not coerced by internally. Externally, you can be forced around, but internally you're free. You no longer fear tyrants, you no longer fear God, you no longer fear anything. You have experienced a kind of a freedom from the fear of fate. So he says you don't need to fear God. And then secondly, he says, and you don't need to seek God, because once you've achieved Stoic enlightenment, as you experience the wisdom and the calm that comes from that enlightenment, you are participating with the divine Logos. So you don't need to seek God because you are participating with the Logos of God. And then thirdly, he says you don't need to look up to God, because actually the Stoic does something more incredible than God, where he says God is without suffering, but the Stoic is beyond it. And he says that so the Stoic does something more incredible than God, because God can't suffer. God does not suffer, the traditional classical notion of God. Whereas the Stoic does, and the Stoic overcomes suffering. It's almost like saying a child is more powerful than God, because God can do everything, right? No effort, no fear of loss, no fear of death, right? God is God. Whereas a child walking demands courage, it demands strength, it demands trying and retrying. So just a child getting to walk is an overcoming that, for the Stoics, God could never do, because God doesn't have to learn how to walk. God can just walk without effort. It's almost like, it's kind of why in Batman versus Superman type scenarios, no one's going to be impressed that Superman beats Batman, but everybody's going to be impressed when Batman beats Superman, because it's the amount of effort that's required. Superman doesn't have to unleash any effort to destroy Batman, but if Batman is to defeat Superman, he has to be incredibly smart, has to outwit Superman. So there you go. So I want to start with those three reflections, just to kind of show where religious critique begins. And one of the takeaways, and this is going to be the takeaway for the whole week really, but is that don't think of these as shutting down a conversation. Because especially with Epicurus' argument, people read it as kind of like a shutting down, like as if this is him trying to definitively say, right, God is incoherent. But actually, think of these people as actually starting a conversation. These are the people, some of the most important kind of big individuals who started this conversation that has been going on for thousands of years before we were born, and that will be going on for thousands of years after we've died. And this is part of the fluid, dynamic nature. So when you see someone like Epicurus make the statement that you'll see him make, then that causes people to respond. And then people critique that response. And if any of these thinkers were still alive today, I would guess that they would be enjoying where the conversation has gone, in that none of these people are trying to shut something down. These are the people that we need to credit as starting a wonderful conversation that is transformative, that's brought you and I here and now to this seminar. So once you've gone through that, the second person that we're looking at, I think, is Jean Meslier. Let's go with that. If I get the order slightly wrong, don't worry. But Jean Meslier is the second. And the reason why I picked him is he's quite unknown, relatively speaking. But he is another first. He is really the first person to have written a systematic kind of atheistic critique of God, and an exegetical critique of the Bible, and a moral critique of religion in general. So there's this philosophical argument against God, there's an exegetical argument against the biblical text, and then there is also a moral argument against how religion is practiced. So you have it all in there. All of those become significant in and of themselves, but he's the first person to do it. There's his book there. I'll show you that book as well. That's the Paul Tillich book, because I take a section out of that to look at Seneca. So whenever you read the Seneca bit. It's just because if I wrote the 3 claims of Seneca without context, they might not make sense. Tillich's such a good writer that he writes a paragraph that really kind of gets to the heart of what Seneca's saying. But this is the book Testament. Now, the fascinating thing about Jean Meslier is that he was a parish priest all his life, and a very good parish priest. I mean, I don't know how good he was. There's not much about him in terms of whether he was a good preacher or anything like that. But he was really, an advocate for the people who went to his church, and he was an advocate for the poor. And he lived in relative poverty himself. He was completely indifferent to money, completely indifferent to treasures. He didn't want to build up anything like that for himself. He gave his money away, and he defended the poor and the oppressed, and often a couple of occasions got in big trouble for it. So he was a very moral individual. And what's fascinating is nobody had any idea whatsoever that he was writing this incredible diatribe against religion and against God and against Christianity. And it was after he died, they found these manuscripts, which he called My Testament, and it was made into this book. So he was expressing what's called in psychoanalysis splitting, where you split your world into 2 compartmentalized zones, right? So in one part of his life, his public life, he's a parish priest. Now I'm guessing just primarily trying to care for the villagers, the congregation and the poor. But then at night, he's poring over this manuscript, critiquing religion in some of the most powerful ways you can imagine. And it was very influential for many French radicals. It's hard to know how he actually kind of reconciled those 2 parts of himself. But I wanted to include him partly because of his significance, but also because in one of a seminar that I gave in the supplemental material of the very first day, I talk about how atheistic critique, the best of it grows out of the theological tradition, because it knows the theological tradition best, so it experiences its contradictions and its deadlocks and its antagonisms. And so Jean Meslier, he was living so deeply the life of faith and the life of a priest, and he studied it. He lived his whole life preaching and caring for the poor and performing the sacraments. And his critique comes out of then not like throwing stones from the outside, but actually from being within it. And so therefore the critique is all the more powerful, all the more heartfelt, and all the more difficult to ignore. So I think you're going to enjoy that. It's a audio that I think you'll enjoy. After that, we jump right into the 21st century to somebody very, very different. We jump to Derren Brown. Now, Derren Brown is a household name in the UK, and up until recently, very few people in America seem to have heard of him. And he's absolutely brilliant. He has done some shows in America designed primarily for an American audience, and I think that's made him a little bit more well known here. But still, relatively speaking, I think the majority of people who I talk to in the US when I mention him don't know who he is. So it's going to be a real treat. You're going to thank me for that. It's going to be worth your $40 just for that recommendation. Hopefully it will anyway. Because he's an illusionist and a magician. And what he does, it's like David Blaine, but different. Because why David Blaine mixes magic with feats of human strength. And often you don't know whether it's magic or human strength, right? So there's some things that maybe he does that are acts of endurance. There's some magic, and then there's this middle place where it's probably magic, but he pretends that it's human endurance, right? Derren Brown does something similar, but with psychological stuff. So psychological experiments, and kind of he plays around with persuasion and how to manipulate people, and shows that with also magic. And there's these things he does that are kind of weird mix. But a lot of what Derren Brown is attempting to do in some of his most interesting shows, and by the way, this is a tradition within the magic circle, is to expose charlatans. It's very important within the circles of magic to try to expose those people who use the techniques of magicians and the techniques of mentalists to manipulate people and to fool people for monetary gain. And so Darren Brown is continuing that tradition, and he is attempting to show in a variety of his stand-up stuff, his live shows and TV shows, he's attempting to demonstrate how manipulation happens, how easy it is to get people to believe certain things and to manipulate and to kind of give people an experience. And what's more interesting is he used to be an evangelical Christian, and a very pious evangelical Christian in his youth. And he experienced a lot of what could be called charismatic events. And so in his adulthood, he wanted to show how easy it can be to replicate those, to make them happen. And so he does replicate them in various ways. I've seen him live doing it and also on TV. And one of the reasons why I included him is simply because, and this goes back to some of the ancient philosophers we looked at, but is that we often experience the world in what we think is an immediate way. And Hegel calls this sense certainty. It's like you go through the world, and how you experience the world is how it is, right? We're almost like a photographic sheet, and the world is the light, and it just kind of impacts itself and places itself upon us. And this is an early form of consciousness where we just see the world as we think it is. So when we talked about Protagoras, who's the first person to begin to question this, and Immanuel Kant is the one to systematically kind of demonstrate it, we could say. Well, Darren Brown is a good example of this, because within the religious world, as we know, we can sometimes have experiences that impact us so deeply that we can't question them, or we don't want to question them, or we don't think they're questionable. We feel that we are having an immediate experience of reality. And when you watch Darren Brown, it can be very disturbing for some people, because what he does is he shows that actually your experience can be manipulated, and we can remember things falsely, we can fool ourselves, we can deceive ourselves in a variety of ways. And in other words, all experience is mediated. And this is again another concept in the work of Hegel, is that when we think we have an immediate experience, it's not immediate, it's mediated. It's mediated through sense of touch, smell, taste, sight. It's mediated through our brains, this big piece of flesh in our heads. It's mediated through what Kant calls certain transcendental categories, which are kind of like things that need to be in place in order for us to experience anything. So what we experience as the way it is isn't the way it is. It's slightly different, right? And we know this more than we did in the past, but it's been shown, for example, how false memory happens. There's various experiments where, there's one experiment I was looking at recently, or it was a few years ago, where they set up lots of cameras in a pub, and then these actors perform this kind of, I think it's like a robbery of some kind, and it's all pretty intense and crazy what happens in the bar. And then they interview the people in the bar who are not actors to talk about what they remember about the situation. And what they discover, of course, is that a variety of people remember things very differently, because this is all recorded. Like one example actually is from Northern Ireland, where there was a bomb went off and in Oma, and it caused devastation and death. And there was one thing that happened, which is someone's hand was blown off, and somebody picked up the hand. And what they discovered is a number of people thought that they were the one who picked up the hand. And it's unlikely that they were lying. It was just in the trauma of the event, and then in hearing about what happened after the event, they began to remember things differently, because trauma is a type of short-circuiting of our minds, so that things become disjointed and hard to recall. And so when you watch Darren Brown, you just begin to see that things that you thought are unquestionable are questionable, right? Experiences that you've had, they do have alternative explanations or possibilities, and that's incredibly important, again, just for the this dialectic movement that we're talking about in Atheism for Lent, where you begin to have a little bit of distance from your belief. And that distance doesn't destroy it. That distance isn't negative, it's actually positive. It allows you to then think about alternatives and then reflect on those alternatives and see what comes out of that and begin to move things forward. So there's something about Derren Brown that is quite disturbing at first if you're coming from kind of out of say an evangelical position, but disturbing in the best possible sense. You're going to love it. And I think the one I mentioned this week, because there's a variety of shows that I talk about, but I think the one that I give it's called How to Convert an Atheist. And he shows how easy it is to get someone to believe in God through. And what's really interesting is he picks someone difficult. So he shows how easy it is to convert someone who has a kind of like residual sense of God within them. And I think what he does, if I can recall correctly, he puts people into this basement of a church who don't believe in ghosts, but they're left alone in the dark. And the ones that get scared are ones that, even though they don't believe in ghosts, they get scared about ghosts, right? And he gets rid of them because they'll be easy to convert, right? He gets the person who doesn't feel scared. He says that's more difficult, and then shows what kind of techniques can be used. So I think you're going to enjoy Derren Brown. And once you kind of see one show, you'll kind of want to watch some of the others. Then we move from Derren Brown into Darwin. Yes, I wanted to put Darwin in because Darwin is obviously a very central figure in the modern world. And his discoveries directly critiqued one of the most popular arguments for the existence of God that was around at the time, which was most clearly expressed by someone called William Paley. And it's the argument from design, the argument that what we see in the world seems to have a designer. Just like if you found a watch sitting in a forest, you would immediately think that there is a watchmaker. So when you look at the world, because of its intricacy, you'll think of a world maker. And I wanted to include Darwin partly because he offers this interesting alternative explanation. Again, that being important in relation to just opening up an alternative explanation that allows for dialectical movement, that allows you to kind of start to feel decentered in a hopefully a productive way. But the other reason why I wanted to do it is because Darwin was a very religious man. And even when he was on the Beagle, wasn't it, his boat, a lot of the sailors would kind of laugh at him because he would quote the Bible as this source of moral authority, like as correct. And it wasn't because they weren't religious. They were religious. They just weren't as religious as he was. He was just a very pious man trying to take his faith very seriously. And that's important because what you'll discover, and a lot of you know this because you are this person, right? You are the idiot I'm about to explain, right? Within the religious world, there are a lot of people who don't take it that seriously. They go to church every week and whatever, but they don't take it that seriously. And therefore, they don't kind of like deconstruct it and they don't move beyond it or into something else. They just kind of stay there. It's the idiots who take it really seriously, who destroy their entire record collection, who give all of their money to the church and who become missionaries or whatever. The ones who kind of say, oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to go as deep into this as possible. They are the ones who often find that it doesn't hold. They're the ones who experience certain deadlocks and contradictions and follow them. And it takes a lot of courage to follow them because often you lose your friends. Often you lose a lot of inner existential security in doing this. But it's the fool who goes, I'm going to go all the way, right? Who kind of begins to follow this thread and pull the thread until the classical notion of confessional Christianity seems to begin to fall away, and then something else begins to emerge, whatever that something else is. And I know this in my own work, but also in the people who follow me, time and time again, they're like, yeah, I was the one who took it really seriously. And my critique is not a critique that comes from without, it's a critique that comes from within. So it's really a replication of Jean Meslier. Right? I see that time and time again in, as I say, the people who follow my work and who I engage with, is there is that Jean Meslier kind of sense in which you're so in it and you so explore it and you so go deep that actually people who are kind of the less religious in your community kind of find it disturbing and laugh at it and find it a bit weird. And so that's also Darwin. And Darwin didn't give up his religious worldview easily. It was difficult for him, and his wife was very religious, and he respected her immensely and respected her beliefs immensely. So it's nice when there's a little snippet from his autobiography that you'll be listening to that I think will help you see that struggle. And I actually think some of you will relate to that struggle that you see in him and relate to his humanity. And I kind of wanted to put it in for that reason. And then there's Robert Ingersoll. And I don't know how many of you know Robert Ingersoll, but I wanted to put him in because for a few reasons. But he was writing in the 19th century, and he wasn't so much a writer, he was an orator. He was a public speaker. He lived at a time when public speaking was at a golden age, and people would pay to hear a speaker. And he was one of the best. So he was like a Christopher Hitchens of his day. He was this large, charismatic, intelligent, quick-thinking, funny individual who could hold an entire audience in rapture, often for up to 3 hours. And he would memorize his talks, and he would give them in this extemporaneous way. And he would kind of like have asides, and basically would really enthrall his audience. And people would spend a lot of money to go and hear him speak. And he spoke on a number of issues, but one of his favourite issues to speak on was agnosticism and religious critique and the critique of hell. And I wanted to put him in because he's like the first kind of public, popular, let's call it evangelical atheist or whatever, right? Because he was living at a time where the technology allowed for him to travel and for audiences to gather. And I think we're, by the way, entering into a new golden age of public speaking. I'm excited about the possibilities. I don't know if you're like me, but if someone asks me what music are you into, I have to confess that I don't listen to much music. I'm always listening to podcasts, right? There's more and more spoken word, and it's capturing the attention of millions. There's people now, instead of listening to music while they're working, they're listening to podcasts and they're listening to lectures. And it's wonderful because in the past, if you were driving for your job, you couldn't kind of engage your mind, really. You have to drive for 8 hours a day, and you just had to basically shut off. But now you can stick in podcasts, you can stick in lectures, you can really engage your mind critically while you're driving around or operating a forklift or doing whatever it is. So we're living in this really interesting age, and also more and more people now are paying to go and hear people speak. And this is why I get to do what I do. I'm a living proof of this return to the importance of the public intellectual. Because when I was traveling last year or the year before last with Rob Bell on his tour, the venues, when I asked who else had been playing in the venue, increasingly they were saying, oh, we had a podcasters in, we had a speaker in, right? We had a comedian in. These people who are just basically speaking from a microphone. And of course they love that, because if AC/DC rocks up to a venue, it's like you're there all day setting up, you're there all night taking down. It's a messy event with lots of rubbish and all of that, and there's parties and drunkenness and all of this. Whereas with a speaker, like me and Rob rock up at like 6 o'clock, and we do a sound check for 5 minutes. We sit in the green room, and then we go out and we speak for an hour and a half, and then everyone goes home, and all the people at the end have to do is switch off the lights and turn off the PA. So it's much easier than having like a band. So we're living in this age again, but Robert Ingersoll is like the first to do this, and he was a very charismatic individual, so I wanted to put him in there, and I thought it would be a nice discovery for some of you if you don't know who he is. And then finally there's Anthony Flew. And Anthony Flew's fascinating. So he was writing in the late 20th century. He just died in the He just died like 10 years ago, I think, around maybe 2007, 2008, not 100% sure. And the article that I include I think it still stands as the most read philosophical article in the world, right? Which, isn't a big deal, but actually it is, in the sense that there's probably a big drop between number one and number two, but it's been translated into dozens of languages, and it was incredibly significant. And it's called Theology and Falsification. And Anthony Flew's interest, and here's this, I told you at the beginning, there's an interesting story about him. And there is, basically, he was a very famous analytic philosopher, critical of religion, critical of the existence of God. And then near the end of his life, he came out with a book, I think it's called There Is a God. And it was co-authored by this evangelical Christian guy called, let me just see if I can find his name, Voorhees, Abraham Voorhees. And it was really interesting because basically he seemed like Flew was saying that he was moving towards deism, even towards Christianity, and he was embracing intelligent design. This was a very big shock to everybody. And the book came out, and say it was kind of like a little bit of a turn up for the books. And often within confessional Christian circles, just like any circle, by the way, is if someone converts to your position, you want to make a big deal of it if they were an enemy, right? If there's a Democrat who becomes a Republican, or a Republican who becomes a Democrat, then, oh, it's great. You want to cheer about that, right? So a lot of people made a big deal of this. But then there's a guy called Mark Oppenheim, is that his name? Oppenheimer, sorry, who he did some research, and he began to question whether Anthony Flew really was behind this book. What he basically argued is Flew was in his 80s. He was undergoing a very severe cognitive decline, like a type of dementia, and he was being manipulated by some people to write this book about God. So then there was that big critique. And so then Anthony Flew came out and he wrote something saying, no, he's not being manipulated. This is his book. This is his position. And he stands by it. But of course, then some people said, well, if he is suffering from dementia and he is being manipulated, then he would say that, right? So there's a bit of back and forth about it. And it's an interesting thing to look into because the book does not sound like Flew at all. That was one of the arguments, is does not look like it's written by Flew. And in fact, another argument was that immediately after the publication of this book, Flew was interviewed about it, and Flew couldn't remember any of the things that he said. So in the book, he was talking about various philosophers, but when he was asked about those philosophers, he couldn't remember them. So something fishy was going on. Now, two things to say about this. One is, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't affect what he wrote before, right? So what we're going to look at is his most famous essay that he wrote, I think it was in the 1930s. But two is, where do I stand on this? Well, I think they're both right? I have a friend who he's a doctor in analytic philosophy. He lectured in analytic philosophy. He was actually my lecturer briefly. A very, very smart guy who became a very respected BBC journalist, TV and radio journalist, and TV and radio presenter. And he would often, I don't think it's bad to say his name actually, so he's called William Crawley. And William Crawley, is a very brilliant philosopher. He studied philosophy and theology, but then, became a presenter. He would interview and still does, interview a lot of academics. And he interviewed Anthony Flew shortly after the book came out. And he said to me, they couldn't use the interview. That they interviewed him for a while, but it was completely nonsensical. He said the guy just had a very serious cognitive decline. And so there's something going on that probably Anthony Flew, to some extent, obviously stands by what was written, but it feels like there was some sort of manipulation going on. So anyway, there you go. That was the interesting story about Flew. But the argument that Flew makes is, I'm going to actually come back to it because I want him to have the last word. So before I talk about that, I'll just sum up the journey so far. We've had Protagoras, we've had Epicurus and Seneca, Meslier, Ingersoll, Darwin and Brown. And really why I brought all of them together, I've talked about the individual reasons, but one of the reasons why I brought all of them together is just to kind of show how they spark off a question, a critique that needs to be addressed and looked at. That this is not about them giving some definitive answer, but rather each of them opens up the possibility for discussion. So really what starts off is what Paul Tillich would call an unbroken myth. You have a way of looking at the world that just holds. You just believe it because you were told it, because everyone around you believes it, because you've never questioned it. It's in you before you can even think rationally, right? Before you become an adolescent and start reading Nietzsche or whatever, you already have this. It's just the way it is. And Tillich calls this an unbroken myth. And it is basically at some point that gets challenged. It gets challenged either by someone you meet, or it gets challenged by something you read, or it gets challenged by a question that you start to ask yourself. But in some way, there is a moment when your unbroken myth is challenged. And then Tillich says this is where fundamentalist occurs. Fundamentalism is not the unbroken myth. Fundamentalism is basically the repressed questioning of the unbroken myth. So what happens whenever the questions start to arise, you've got one of two options. Either you go, I'm not listening, I'm not listening, I'm not listening, right? And you double down. And then he says that's really the start of fundamentalism, which, by the way, means fundamentalism is not certainty, it's repressed uncertainty. So it takes you into a really interesting line to understand what modern atheism is, which is not someone who is certain. You get lots of people who are certain, but they don't have anger or aggression. They just feel a little bit superior to you, right? But they don't get angry at you. But kind of what we think of as modern fundamentalism, we see a lot of anger and frustration and bitterness and often attacks on modern culture, modern civilization, which is a signal of a repressed uncertainty of the position. So Tillich says either you close yourself down or you allow those questions to do something. And one of two responses to that can happen. Either you find a new unbroken myth, so you find something that you think you can hold on to completely, or you enter into the world of broken myth. And Tillich argues for this notion of a broken myth and connects this with Christianity, etc. But that's what's going on here in this first week. Is I want to kind of show the kind of beginnings of that rupture, that like a slight, what can be called alienation from your own belief, a slight alienation from what one assumes, what one thinks, but an alienation that is productive. And we're going to see where that goes. That's what the coming weeks are all about. So this first week is simply going, oh, I feel it, right from the early Greeks and then the Roman critique of Stoicism, right through to Ingersoll and Darwin and Meslier, feeling that critique, seeing that it comes from a deep place, often a theological place, and being ready to kind of like go, okay, instead of closing my ears to it and doubling down, I'm going to take this journey. And so why do I want to finish with Anthony Flew? Because in a way, Anthony Flew gives a good warning about what I've just said, right? Because what I've just said is experience that alienation from your own kind of like beliefs, whatever they are, right? Which you already probably have experienced, but allow yourself to feel it. Allow yourself to open up to it. And then we're going to see where that goes. Anthony Flew gives a warning of the worst way we can do that, basically. So in this article, Flew makes a critique. And he says basically what often happens is when someone critiques a view of God and says God is incoherent, like Epicurus, what happens is then the theologian just changes something a little bit to kind of get out of the critique. And what they're doing is they're not actually substantively changing their kind of metaphysical, classical position. They're just kind of changing it slightly so that the critique misses it. And Flew's going, okay, that's fine. You do that once. And then Flew says, so then the atheist gives a second critique. And then the theologian, shifts a little bit more. Again, not challenging the central idea, but just shifting a little bit to get away from that critique. And then Flew says, okay, so we do it a third time and a fourth time. And then Flew basically argues that what you discover is there is this dance in which every time the atheist fires the bullet, the theologian dodges it. And then Flew says, until you get to a point where in frustration the atheist asks, is there any way to falsify the claim? Is there anything I could say that would falsify what you're claiming? And Flew says, if you discover that there's no way to falsify it, in other words, the person you're arguing with is always going to change their definition of God just slightly so that you can never make a claim against it. He says, then it's a meaningless claim. And to be called something meaningless in analytic philosophy, especially at that time, was worse than saying something is false. Because if something's false, at least it's meaningful, but it's wrong. But if something's meaningless, it doesn't even rise to the level of truth and falsity. So, the worst insult in analytic philosophy is what you're saying is meaningless. And so Anthony Flew goes, okay, this is a technique that is often used by apologists. Apologists will just shift the goalposts in slight ways all of the time, and then suddenly you realize, oh, they're just doing that, they'll just keep doing that, so therefore their claim can't be verified and it can't be falsified, therefore you don't need to worry about it. And I say that is kind of the worst way to go with this questioning, because in a way it's not about substantively following the argument, dialectically discovering where it goes, what it does within you. It's about trying to maintain your position at all costs, moving around so that you don't have to move, right? Yeah, it's almost like dancing in place. You're dodging things like in the Matrix when he kind of dodges the bullets, standing in place. There's no movement. There is just this constant kind of, no significant movement, just this slight movement while standing in place. And I don't want to say too much about the actual piece because you're going to read it, but he does use this very interesting parable of the invisible gardener, where basically someone says there's a gardener who looks after this patch in a forest, and the person says, well, why can't I see them? And he says, oh, well, the gardener's invisible. Well, why can't these dogs smell him? Oh, well, because he doesn't have a scent. Well, let's put up some barbed wire to see if we can kind of keep the gardener out, and then we'll see if the patch gets messy. Go like, oh, well, the gardener can walk through barbed wire. And this is an example of what Anthony Flew is talking about. Okay, then, so just to sum up, this is the first week. This is the basic kind of critiques, a kind of a sense of the basic origin of the critique of religion. And the main thing to take out of it is how it's the beginning of a journey of deepening, not the end of it. And in each of these, you'll discover the thinker is really trying to either say to the listener, or they're expressing this in themselves, a type of alienation within themselves that allows for this gap and allows for this questioning. And we're actually going to see where that questioning goes. So that's the second week. I'm just going to look and see if there are any questions before I disappear. Let's see. So Nina says, Seneca says God doesn't suffer, but in the classical notion of God, doesn't he suffer? Well, actually, it's almost like the other way around in many ways. Like when I talk about the classical notion, and in philosophy, when they talk about the classical notion of God, the metaphysical notion of God, God is this unmoved mover. God is kind of like this is the Greek notion of God. God does not change. God does not develop. God does not evolve. God is, and God is simple, which means God is complete oneness, complete wholeness, complete substance. And so that's what Seneca is critiquing. But I think what you're talking about is that within the Christian tradition, there are a variety of positions that talk about God in terms of process. So in the more conservative evangelical world, there's what's called open theism. There's also progressive theology, which follows the work of Whitehead. And then there's radical theology, which is the tradition that I'm in. And they're all actually, yes, doing exactly what you're saying, is they are also a critique of the metaphysical God. That's why if you look at Seneca's argument, which you'll see tomorrow, and you've obviously already know, is that it's not necessarily a critique of every God. It's a critique of a type of God. And that's why, in a way, it's not about saying whether it's false, because it's true. It's true of something. And the question is, what is it true of? What notion of the absolute does it critique? And then does it allow for other notions of the absolute to develop? And you think about someone like Jürgen Moltmann is an example of someone who rejects this classical notion as well. So yeah, what you're talking about very much is that Seneca is critiquing a kind of, when I say classical, Greek classical notion, and what you find within the Christian tradition, not all of it actually, but within a lot of the later Christian tradition, are notions that God does suffer. And of course, at an extreme, there's this notion of Christ who suffers, who is God. Tim says, is it even possible to be a Christian properly and accurately understood without being an atheist? Yeah, Tim, I mean, you're kind of potentially giving away the punchline of the joke before we got there. But this is actually a really interesting thing that you've said, and it sounds weird at first, but actually some of the most interesting thinkers of the 20th and 21st century have said some bizarre things like this. So Heidegger said, how did Heidegger say? Atheism is a purification of theism, something like that. Simone Weil, who we're going to be looking at, has a basic idea of atheism as being profoundly part of Christianity. Ernst Bloch says only an atheist can be a Christian, only a good Christian can be an atheist. And Slavoj Žižek says something similar, so does Thomas Altizer. They all are playing around in the same field. Some of them are meaning the same thing, but they're exploring this notion that we're looking at in this, that atheism and theism are profoundly interlinked. And by the time we get to the second last week, which is probably the hardest week, we're going to delve into what that means in its more sophisticated form. I mean, only an introduction, but we're going to start getting into this kind of weird place. Lacan does it as well, by the way. He says that basically the best atheists are the Jesuits. Right? They're kind of like Jean Meslier. Lacan is saying, like, if you really want to get to the critique of theology, you want to be in it. And the reason why he says that is because for him, atheism is not simply the belief in a God out there. It's the belief in any big other, like money bringing happiness, like your government having a substantial truth that you can, need to obey, that you need to act in a certain way in the world, right? So basically Lacan is saying that theism is part of a much broader structure, which he calls belief in the big other. This is why he says God is unconscious. So he has this notion of the big other. So theism is the belief in a God, but anyone who believes in things like, say, money bringing happiness, or a new car bringing wholeness, or if you look the right way, go out with the right person, if you have the right products, everything will be good. That for him is also a theistic structure, right? And when he talks about atheism, he's talking about something that is not just a critique of some God, it's a critique of all of that structure in itself. And he makes an argument that those who are within the theological tradition, they come to a point where they find that God, the notion of God, actually critiques all of that. They find it in the deepest part of their own tradition. There is a rejection of that very idea. And so he says that that's why they actually are the true atheists, because they can potentially be freed from that notion in all of its secular forms as well as its sacred forms. That's the nature of what I'm trying to do, because for me there's so much idolatry in the world that we need to be freed from. And weirdly, paradoxically, theology can lead to a freedom from that. And that's what the practice of pyrotheology is. Decentering practices are practices designed to free us from that big other, and to see that as actually the heart of of salvation. That's is the truth of religion, and it's also the truth of philosophy and the truth of psychoanalysis, right? So all of that is in it. So that's what we're going to discover: is what if theism is just one part of a bigger structure that needs to be critiqued theologically, and that atheism, to be at its deepest truth, is about a critique of all sorts of giving ourselves over to some external authority that demands we act in certain ways. And this is why, in some ways, at the end, we're going to reconnect with Seneca. Because Seneca, he basically talks about freedom from fear of the gods, freedom from seeking the gods, and freedom from envy of the gods. And that actually is a primitive way of describing what I think we're trying to do in paratheology. I think it's a very early Stoic example of something that is happening within the religious tradition itself, and that actually when you experience that, you are hitting the very heart of faith itself. But I've got to show you why I think that's the case. Oh yeah, Brooke says the same thing as me. He's talking about the Greek view of God as perfect, impassible, unchangeable. Yeah. And then Jeremiah says, where does the title Astronauts and Empty Space come in? I was hoping no one would ask that, actually. The reason for that is because, and I never mentioned it, is that a lot of these people are critiquing the notion of a God that's out there in space, like us, some kind of bigger version of ourselves. God is an astronaut, and so actually there is no God astronaut in there. It's just empty space. And in previous years, I structured this talk around that notion. So I would start off and talk about the idea of there being a God up in the heavens, kind of like an astronaut God. And that these people are primarily critiquing that notion of God as an astronaut, and they're primarily critiquing the notion of God in space somewhere. And I even used the example of C.S. Lewis, who he was very much an idealist. He really liked George Berkeley, the Irish philosopher, and Berkeley had this notion of God as you can't find God in space. God is kind of everywhere and nowhere. And C.S. Lewis talked about it like Shakespeare. You don't find Shakespeare in a Hamlet play, but Shakespeare is everywhere in the Hamlet play because Shakespeare wrote it. And so I was just basically, astronauts in empty space is a connection to this notion that most of these thinkers we've looked at, or we're going to be looking at this week, are critiquing that notion of God as an astronaut. And are saying that notion of God, actually, there is no astronaut up there. So if I hadn't said that, people would be scratching their heads going, why did he call it that? Now you know. All right. Listen, thanks so much for checking in with this. I am truly excited for this journey. I'll be commenting, I'm hoping, every day on the material. I'm really hoping that you find stuff that you like. Of course, you're not going to like everything. In fact, you might not like very much. But I'm confident you're going to find some things in this that you're going, oh, this is cool. I need to look more deeply into it. So I hope you enjoy this journey. I'm going to talk to you next week in person. And as I say, I'll be engaging on the Facebook page. So I'll see you all there. Take care. Bye-bye.